If you'd have asked me a year ago where I stood on the topic of digital games versus physical copies, I'd have said physical all the way. But 3 instances this year have me questioning and changing that stance. Back in April, we got the utterly fantastic Streets of Rage 4, and initially that was a digital-only release. It really bugged me at the time, but hey, it was Streets of Rage 4, there was no way I'd be missing out on that, so I pre-ordered it on the PlayStation Store. Not long after though, it got a physical release, and I'm not talking about limited run. I'm talking about a standard box edition, sat on a shelf as a standard game, go grab it at your leisure, but while I was definitely tempted, I didn't double dip. In a similar fashion, Final Fantasy VIII Remastered, something fans thought we might never get, came out as a digital exclusive in September 2019, and I handed my money over immediately after they'd announced it. This year, Square Enix gave it a physical release, but again, I didn't pick one up. Those instances genuinely surprised me. Now, I'm still primarily a physical guy. If they're ever back in stock, I'm hoping to get a PlayStation 5 that has a disc drive for 2 reasons. The first is simply that I have a lot of physical PlayStation 4 games I want to bring with me, seeing as the new console's backwards compatible. The second is competitive pricing. When the Final Fantasy VII Remake was launching, it was a staggering $59.99 to pre-order digitally, but Shop2 were taking physical pre-orders for a comparatively much cheaper $44.85. Stores have to compete with each other, and that results in better prices for consumers. At the moment, the PlayStation, Xbox, and Switch eShops are more or less uncontested in ways that might actually breach the UK's Competition Act 1998, but hey, I'm no lawyer. That said, I have an increasingly large library of digital-only versions of games that have physical releases, and I can maybe see that trend continuing. When I was growing up, physical versions were the only thing you could get. That's just how games came out. It wasn't until the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 generation that I had to even consider the prospect of digital games. For that generation, I was strictly a physical-only guy. The sole exceptions I made were for digital-only games, including Scott Pilgrim, which, don't you worry, we'll come to in just a bit. Some games weren't even available to buy digitally, especially nearer the start of that era, and the used games market gave a cash-strapped student a cheap way to grab titles that were maybe a year or 2 old. These days, I still heavily prioritize physical PlayStation 3 games for a very simple reason: limited hard drive space. The PS3 runs games from the actual Blu-ray disc, and while a handful of titles do have mandatory installs, I find that to be an optimal use of the console's modest storage capacity. That changed with the PlayStation 4. Whether you had a physical disc or a digital download, everything installs to and runs from the hard drive, making the Blu-ray nothing more than a glorified access key. It reached a point where I had to replace the stock 500GB internal drive with a 2TB one, and even then I later added a 4TB USB 3.0 external drive to store games on. Even with a total of 6TB, I sometimes end up juggling games, uninstalling some titles to make room for others. Despite trying to Tetris the data onto my drives, digital has provided a number of conveniences. As lazy as it sounds, not having to get up and grab a game off the shelf makes me more likely to fire up a digital title compared to a physical copy. Games I originally bought physically that were later a part of PlayStation Plus, like Just Cause 3, saw me happily convert straight over while never touching the disc again. The digital store gave me the ability to buy pretty much any game at any time. In a physical shop, a game's on the shelves as a new release for around 8 weeks before they need that same physical spot for the next big thing. That's simply not the case in a digital storefront. I can find something that came out years ago, buy it, and know that, unlike a second-hand purchase of a physical game, some of that money goes back to the people who actually made the game, supporting them. Alright, there are a couple of big issues with what I just said. Put your keyboards down a second, I'm not going to shy away from proactively addressing them. Let's talk about licensed games. Platinum's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Transformers Devastation? Gone. Your only option is to grab a used physical copy now. The PSN and XBLA re-releases of The Simpsons Arcade, X-Men, and Turtles? Again? Gonzo. But this time there's no physical release to fall back on. If you missed them, you missed them, that's it, end of story. Scott Pilgrim's perhaps the most high-profile example, and is now finally getting resurrected, but it increasingly feels like every digital game's on borrowed time before inevitably facing PT's fate. A title you can't even re-download anymore, regardless whether you redeemed it at the time. The entire Wii eShop got taken down. That's a whole catalogue of exclusive digital-only games you'll likely never be able to purchase again. Sony recently removed PlayStation 3 and Vita games from their web store. True, you can still access the storefronts and buy games from the actual consoles, but I have to wonder how long that will last before that gets shut down too. I also have to wonder where the money goes once the studio's dead. Capcom Vancouver was shuttered after the release of Dead Rising 4, but I can still buy that game. I assume it goes to the publishers rather than the developers? Where do you stand morally in instances like Metal Gear Solid 5, where Konami is still selling the game despite a very public, messy breakup with the series creator Hideo Kojima? Then we have account bans and takeovers. Any of these companies can terminate or lock your account, including your access to your games. I somewhat experienced this when I pre-ordered Sonic Mania. A PayPal error caused thousands of customers' PSN pre-orders to be automatically refunded, putting all of those gamers' PlayStation accounts into negative balances, and that resulted in an instant ban. Even though Sony were aware of the error, it still took them 3 days to restore access to the accounts of those affected. We also see massive data protection breaches in the news daily, including instances of unencrypted usernames and passwords of millions of accounts being leaked. That happened to an old email and password of mine that was unfortunately still associated with my Grand Theft Auto Online account, allowing an unknown person from far off shores into my Rockstar social club. Thankfully, I didn't have any payment method saved to it, and I got my account back after a week or two, but it was quite a shock all the same. It leads a lot of people to swear off digital altogether. They claim physical versions are the true road to preservation. I can't count how many times I've heard the argument of, let's see them come over to my house and take my discs away. Sadly, the preservation argument doesn't really hold water. Pretty much any game you buy nowadays is going to receive a patch, oftentimes as early as day 1. Commonly, what's on the disc represents version 1.0 of a game, not what's actually experienced by most players, and that's assuming the full game is even on the disc. Yeah, I'm looking at Activision and Spyro specifically. For those who don't know what I'm referring to, the Spyro Reignited trilogy only had the first of the 3 games on the disc. Granted, it got a later reprint that supposedly does have all 3 games on it, but this certainly hasn't been the case for every title that's gone gold while incomplete. Games get new content through DLC, and while some are re-released as Game of the Year or the hilariously titled Complete Editions, not even those are guaranteed to have all of the content on the disc. Final Fantasy XV Royal Edition and Street Fighter V Champion Edition are just 2 of the many examples where you get the vanilla disc with a slip of paper containing a single-use code to redeem the DLC. Even if you have a disc that's the most up-to-date version of the game with all of the post-release content on it, you can't guarantee you'll always be able to play it. Games are increasingly tied to online servers that can and will get shut down eventually. Fortnite, Overwatch, sure. They're online multiplayer games, you knew what you were getting into, but even single-player games like Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor have features reliant on remote servers that will disappear when they go offline. Many of those concerns might not apply to retro games, but those titles, and the consoles they're played on, have their own problems. Many of them are 20 to 30 years old. Their batteries are dead, their capacitors could be leaking, and their disk drives simply stop working through good old wear and tear. Whatever your approach, your entertainment media is temporary and fleeting. I'm not really here to go into a tangent about emulation and potential piracy as the true saviors of gaming's history. Maybe that's a topic for a future video. That said, I do think it's my reluctant acceptance that all my games will die eventually, which opened me up to the idea of digital gaming. I evidently don't resell my games, although I can see that being a draw for others, and they're not going to last forever. The sheer convenience of digital, not having to go to a store, not having to say no to, we have a pre-owned copy for £2 less if you'd prefer that, do you want the collector's edition? Can I interest you in some Funko Pops from this game? Do you know about our loyalty program? Not having to wait for an online order to arrive in the post, not having to get up and swap discs, it's all very tempting. The only thing stopping me now is the idea of being locked into the PlayStation Store's prices instead of having multiple retailers competing for my money. What are your views on the physical-digital divide? Do you mix and match like I do? Or do you strictly stick to just the one format? Let me know in the comments below, and also give me a heads up if this kind of discussion video is something you'd like to see more of in between my proper reviews and meatier videos. As for here and now, this has been Sam, I'm signing out, and I will see you in the next one.